Before the roar of the interstate highways, before the rhythmic thrum of transcontinental flight, and even before the iron horses of the railroad began to gallop across the plains, America was a country divided by its own geography. In the early 19th century, the United States was a collection of coastal enclaves huddled against the Atlantic, looking inward at a vast, untamed wilderness that felt as distant as another planet. To the west lay the Appalachian Mountains, a formidable spine of ancient rock and dense forest that acted as a silent, impenetrable wall. If you were a farmer in the Ohio River Valley, your harvest of wheat or corn was essentially trapped. To send it to the markets of New York or Philadelphia, you would have to haul it over the mountains by wagon, a journey so arduous and expensive that the cost of transportation often exceeded the value of the crop itself. Many simply gave up, or worse, considered seceding from the young nation to trade more easily with the Spanish in New Orleans. The dream of a united America was physically crumbling under the weight of its own mud and mountains. This is the story of a ditch, a simple hand-dug trench filled with water that defied the skeptics, bankrupted its enemies, and eventually forged the backbone of a superpower. It is the story of the Erie Canal. Before the roar of the interstate highways, before the rhythmic thrum of transcontinental flight, and even before the iron horses of the railroad began to gallop across the plains, America was a country divided by its own geography. In the early 19th century, the United States was a collection of coastal enclaves huddled against the Atlantic, looking inward at a vast, untamed wilderness that felt as distant as another planet. To the west lay the Appalachian Mountains, a formidable spine of ancient rock and dense forest that acted as a silent, impenetrable wall. If you were a farmer in the Ohio River Valley, your harvest of wheat or corn was essentially trapped. To send it to the markets of New York or Philadelphia, you would have to haul it over the mountains by wagon, a journey so arduous and expensive that the cost of transportation often exceeded the value of the crop itself. Many simply gave up, or worse, considered seceding from the young nation to trade more easily with the Spanish in New Orleans. The dream of a united America was physically crumbling under the weight of its own mud and mountains. This is the story of a ditch, a simple hand-dug trench filled with water that defied the skeptics, bankrupted its enemies, and eventually forged the backbone of a superpower. It is the story of the Erie Canal, a feat of engineering so improbable that Thomas Jefferson once called it a little short of madness. To understand the scale of this madness, one must first visualize the New York wilderness of 1817. It was a landscape of ancient hemlocks, cedar swamps teeming with malaria-carrying mosquitoes, and the relentless gray limestone of the Niagara Escarpment. There were no civil engineers in America at the time. The very profession didn't exist. There were no power shovels, no dynamite, and no hydraulic lifts. There was only the human will, the strength of mules, and the vision of a man named DeWitt Clinton. Clinton, the governor of New York, was a man of towering ambition and equally towering ego. His critics mocked the project as Clinton's big ditch, a wasteful expenditure of public funds that they believed would end in a muddy grave. But Clinton saw what they did not: a water-level route through the only gap in the Appalachian chain. He saw a future where a barrel of flour could travel from Buffalo to New York City in 10 days instead of 3 weeks, and for a fraction of the cost. The sheer audacity of the plan was staggering. They proposed to dig a canal 363 miles long through solid rock and bottomless swamp, rising and falling 565 feet through a series of 83 locks. It was the longest canal in the world at the time, and it was to be built by farmers, immigrants, and self-taught surveyors who learned engineering by doing it.
The first shovelful of earth was turned on July 4th, 1817, near Rome, New York. The choice of starting point was tactical. The land there was flat, the digging easy. Clinton knew he needed a quick win to prove to the legislature that the project was feasible. Thousands of laborers, many of them Irish immigrants fleeing famine and poverty, descended upon the Mohawk Valley. They were paid 80 cents a day, a king's ransom for a laborer in those times, along with a ration of whiskey to dull the pain of the back-breaking work. Imagine the scene, miles of forest being cleared by hand. These men developed a stump puller, a massive tripod with a screw mechanism that could yank a centuries-old tree from the earth in minutes. It was the first of many inventions born of necessity on the canal banks. As the summer heat descended, the work became a grueling battle against nature. In the Montezuma swamp, over 1,000 men fell ill with swamp fever or malaria. Work ground to a halt as the laborers shivered in their lean-tos, their skin yellowing, their strength sapless. Yet they pressed on. They dug through the biting cold of upstate winters when the ground was like iron, using black powder to blast through the rock. The black powder was unstable, and many men lost their lives in the premature explosions that echoed to the valleys like cannon fire. The engineering challenges were not just about digging, they were about the physics of water. Water is heavy, and it is restless. To keep a canal level, you must build aqueducts, bridges for water. The canal had to cross the Mohawk River and several smaller streams. The builders constructed massive stone arches, waterproofed with a secret recipe of hydraulic cement made from local limestone. This cement, which hardened underwater, was another accidental discovery of the canal's self-taught engineers. Without it, the canal would have leaked into the porous earth, leaving the boats stranded in the mud. As you walk along the ruins of these aqueducts today, you can still see the chisel marks of the stonemasons, men who worked with a precision that rivals modern masonry, despite having nothing but hand tools and the flickering light of oil lamps. Each stone was hauled by oxen and set into place with pulleys, creating a structure that had to withstand the weight of thousands of tons of moving water and the heavy timber boats that would soon traverse it.
By 1823, the middle section of the canal was already humming with activity. But the greatest obstacle lay to the west, the Niagara Escarpment. This was a massive ridge of solid dolomite limestone, a geological wall that stood directly in the path of the canal's progress toward Lake Erie. To the skeptics, this was where Clinton's ditch would surely meet its end. There was no natural gap here, no gentle slope to follow. The water had to be lifted 66 feet up a near vertical cliff. The task fell to Nathan Roberts, another self-taught engineer who had started his career as a simple land surveyor. Roberts sat for days in the woods near what is now Lockport, sketching designs in the dirt with a stick. What he conceived was a masterpiece of 19th century engineering, the Flight of Five. He designed a double set of 5 combined locks, acting like a giant staircase for boats. One set would bring boats up, while the other brought them down, allowing for continuous traffic. To carve this staircase into the rock, laborers used hand drills and black powder, working in a canyon of their own making. The sound of the blasts was constant, a rhythmic thudding that shook the very foundations of the earth. When it was finished, the Flight of Five was hailed as the eighth wonder of the world. It was a cathedral of stone and water, a testament to the idea that no mountain was too high if the human mind was focused enough to climb it. As the canal pushed further west, the landscape of New York began to change in ways no one had fully anticipated. Small hamlets that had once been isolated outposts suddenly found themselves transformed into bustling ports. Places like Rochester, Syracuse, and Buffalo exploded in population almost overnight. Rochester, located where the canal crossed the Genesee River, became America's first boomtown. It was nicknamed the Flower City because the canal allowed the massive wheat harvests of the Genesee Valley to be ground into flour and shipped to the world. Before the canal, a farmer might spend weeks trying to get a few barrels of flour to a market. Now he could watch as thousands of barrels were loaded onto canal boats every single day. The air in these towns was thick with the smell of sawdust, freshly cut limestone, and the omnipresent scent of the mules that powered the entire system. Life on the canal developed its own unique rhythm, a slow, steady pulse that dictated the pace of the young nation. The boats were moved not by steam or sail, but by the raw muscle of mules and horses walking along a narrow path at the water's edge known as the towpath. If you were a traveler on a packet boat, the luxury liners of the Erie Canal, your world was one of 4 miles per hour. This was the speed limit of the canal, designed to prevent the wake of the boats from eroding the earthen banks. It was a meditative pace. Passengers would sit on the flat roofs of the boats, ducking their heads whenever the helmsman yelled "bridge, low bridge," to avoid being swept off by the many low-hanging wooden spans that crossed the water. Underneath them, in the cramped cabins, life was a lesson in communal living. At night, the dining tables were folded away, and silk cords were stretched across the room to hold thin mattresses.
Men, women, and children slept in tiers, separated only by thin curtains, listening to the gentle lap of the water against the hull and the distant clop, clop, clop of the mule teams. For many Americans, this was their first taste of travel for pleasure rather than necessity. They saw the unfolding wilderness of their own country from the comfort of a floating parlor, watching the dark forests of the frontier give way to the neatly ordered fields of a new civilization. The unsung heroes of this liquid highway were the hoggies, the young boys, often orphans or children of the laborers, who drove the mule teams. A hoggie's life was defined by the towpath. They walked 15 to 20 miles a day in all weather, guiding the mules with a whip and a steady voice. They slept in the midships of the boat with the animals, sharing their warmth on cold autumn nights. The bond between a hoggie and his mules was legendary. The animals knew the path so well they could almost walk it in their sleep, stopping instinctively at the locks and leaning into their harnesses when they felt the weight of the boat increase. The towpath was a world unto itself, a narrow strip of dirt that connected the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes. It was here that news was traded, songs were composed, and the culture of the canal was born. The songs often told of the hardships and the humor of the life. The Erie Canal was not just a piece of infrastructure, it was a living, breathing community that stretched across the state. But the canal brought more than just goods and people. It brought ideas. Because the Erie Canal made travel so easy and relatively cheap, it became a conduit for the great social and religious movements of the 19th century. The region of western New York through which the canal passed became known as the burned-over district. It was as if a fire of religious fervor had swept through the valley, leaving behind a landscape transformed by new beliefs. The Second Great Awakening found its most fertile ground here. It was along the canal route that Joseph Smith reported the visions that led to the founding of the Latter-day Saint movement. It was in these canal towns that the abolitionist movement gained its fiercest momentum, as the ease of transport allowed speakers and literature to circulate with unprecedented speed. The canal was the internet of its day, a high-speed, for the time, network that allowed information to flow as freely as the water. Even the women's suffrage movement found its roots in the canal corridor, with the Seneca Falls Convention occurring just a short distance from the canal's waters. The Erie Canal was not just moving barrels of salt and timber, it was moving the very soul of America toward a more modern, more interconnected future. As the 1820s progressed, the financial success of the canal became undeniable. Even before the entire length was completed, the tolls collected on the finished sections were already paying off the massive debt New York had incurred. The big ditch was turning into a gold mine. In New York City, the impact was profound. Before the canal, New York was just one of several major Atlantic ports, often trailing behind Philadelphia and Boston. But once the canal opened, New York City became the gateway to the entire interior of the North American continent. It became the place where the wealth of the West met the capital of Europe. The harbor was soon choked with ships from every corner of the globe, all waiting to unload manufactured goods that would be sent up the Hudson River and into the canal, and to take on the grain, timber, and furs that were flowing down from the frontier. The skyline began to climb, the banks began to multiply, and the frantic, relentless energy that we still associate with Manhattan today began to take shape, fueled by the slow-moving waters of a ditch 300 miles away.
The official completion of the canal in October 1825 was marked by a celebration the likes of which the young republic had never seen. It was called the Wedding of the Waters. A flotilla of boats, led by the Seneca chief, departed from Buffalo on October 26th, carrying Governor DeWitt Clinton and 2 elegant kegs filled with water from Lake Erie. As the boat entered the canal, a signal was sent back to New York City, not by wire or radio, for those did not yet exist, but by a telegraph of cannons. Cannons were stationed every few miles along the entire 363-mile route and down the Hudson River. When the first cannon fired in Buffalo, the next crew heard it and fired theirs, and so on, cascading the sound across the state. In just 90 minutes, the news reached the tip of Manhattan that the Great Lakes were finally connected to the Atlantic. It was the fastest communication of information in human history up to that point. The journey of the Seneca chief took 10 days, a triumphant procession through every canal town, where citizens gathered on the banks to cheer, fire muskets, and hold elaborate banquets. When the boat finally reached New York Harbor, Clinton poured the Lake Erie water into the salty Atlantic, symbolizing the eternal union of the western frontier and the global ocean. The immediate economic impact was nothing short of a miracle. Before the canal, the cost of shipping a ton of grain from Buffalo to New York City was about $100, an astronomical sum that made large-scale farming in the West nearly impossible. Within a year of the canal's opening, that cost plummeted to under $10. The price of consumer goods in the West, tools, furniture, clothing, and books, similarly dropped, as they could now be shipped cheaply from the factories of the East. The canal essentially erased the Appalachian Mountains as a trade barrier. It created a single, unified national market. This sudden drop in shipping costs acted like a shot of adrenaline to the American economy. New York City, which had been competing on somewhat equal footing with Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Boston, suddenly surged ahead, its trade volume tripling in a decade. The city's wealth began to fund the infrastructure of the entire nation, and the New York we recognize today, the financial capital of the world, owes its very existence to the muddy water of the Erie Canal. Yet,
Beyond the grand ceremonies and the economic statistics, there were the smaller, more intricate details of canal life that truly defined the era. Maintenance was a constant, quiet struggle against the elements. The canal was essentially an artificial river held in place by earth and embankments, and water is a relentless force. One of the most persistent threats came from a seemingly harmless source: muskrats. These animals love to burrow into the soft, silty banks of the canal. A single muskrat hole could, over time, allow a small trickle of water to escape. If left unnoticed, that trickle would quickly erode the bank, turning into a torrent that could cause a washout, draining an entire section of the canal and leaving boats stranded in the mud for weeks while repairs were made. Bank watchers were employed to walk the towpaths daily, looking for the telltale signs of bubbles or small leaks. They were the silent guardians of the liquid highway, ensuring that the fragile balance between the water and the earth remained intact. Then there was the issue of the water itself. To keep the canal full, the engineers had to tap into every available stream and river along the route. They built feeders, smaller channels that diverted water from places like the Genesee River or the Black River into the canal. Managing the water levels required a complex system of waste weirs and sluice gates. If a heavy rainstorm hit, the canal could overflow, damaging the banks. If a drought occurred, the water level could drop too low for the boats to float. The canal was a living machine that required constant tuning. The engineers used a technique called puddling to waterproof the bottom. They would spread a layer of clay and gravel, then drive cattle or oxen through it. The animals' hooves would pack the mixture into a dense, impermeable layer that acted like a natural liner. It was a primitive method, but so effective that sections of the original canal remained watertight for over a century. As autumn turned to winter, the canal underwent a dramatic transformation. In late November or early December, the big freeze would arrive. The slow-moving water would thicken into ice, and the canal would officially close for the season. This was a time of forced rest for some, and intense labor for others. The boatmen would tie up their vessels in wide waters or basins, often living on the ice-bound boats throughout the winter. For the canal towns, the Friesen waterway became a social hub. The towpath, once dusty and crowded with mules, became a track for sleighs. The canal itself turned into a miles-long skating rink. People would travel between towns on skates, and some even organized ice boat races, using sails to propel small craft across the slick surface at high speeds. Meanwhile, the state used the winter months to perform the heavy maintenance that was impossible while the water was flowing. They would drain sections of the canal to remove the silt and debris that had accumulated over the year. Lost anchors, dropped cargo, and the occasional sunken boat were all cleared out in the freezing cold of January and February, preparing the ditch for the grand opening of the spring. The canal also birthed industries that were entirely unique to its geography. In Syracuse, the canal passed through massive salt springs. Before the canal, salt was heavy and expensive to move, yet it was essential for preserving meat and fish in a world without refrigeration. With the canal, Syracuse salt could be shipped cheaply to the meatpacking centers of the Midwest and the fishing fleets of the Atlantic. The Salina district of Syracuse became a forest of salt sheds, long, low buildings where brine was boiled in massive kettles or evaporated in huge, shallow pans under the sun. The salt industry and the canal were symbiotic. The salt provided the cargo that kept the boats full, and the canal provided the means to reach the world. By the mid-19th century, Syracuse was producing more salt than anywhere else in the United States, all thanks to the big ditch that ran right through the heart of the city.
By the mid-1830s, the Erie Canal had become a victim of its own monumental success. The original Clinton's Ditch was 40 feet wide and only 4 feet deep, which had seemed vast when it was first dug, but it was now hopelessly congested. The volume of traffic was so great that boats were often backed up for miles at the locks, waiting their turn to be lifted or lowered. The canal was essentially a 363-mile-long traffic jam. It became clear that the canal needed to grow. In 1836, the state began the first enlargement, a massive engineering project that would take nearly 3 decades to complete. The goal was to deepen the canal to 7 feet and widen it to 70 feet, allowing for much larger boats that could carry up to 240 tons of cargo, 6 times the capacity of the original vessels. This enlargement wasn't just about digging, it was about reimagining the entire system. They replaced the original wooden locks with massive double-chambered stone locks made of hand-cut limestone. These double locks allowed traffic to move in both directions simultaneously, significantly reducing the wait times and increasing the efficiency of the entire waterway. As the canal grew, so did the unique culture of the people who lived and worked on it. A new class of Americans emerged, the canalers. Unlike the transient laborers who built the ditch, these were families who made the water their permanent home. For many boat captains, their vessel was both their place of business and their primary residence. The stern of the boat often contained a small, surprisingly tidy cabin where the captain's wife would cook meals on a tiny coal stove, hang curtains over the portholes, and raise children who learned to walk on a moving deck before they ever set foot on a sidewalk. These canal children were a common sight, often tethered to the boat with long ropes so they wouldn't drown if they accidentally tumbled overboard into the murky water. To the people in the shore-bound towns, the canalers were a breed apart, tough, independent, and often viewed with a mix of suspicion and fascination. They had their own slang, their own songs, and a reputation for fierce loyalty and even fiercer brawling. The locks were the social hubs of this linear universe. Since every boat had to stop and wait at a lock, these locations became natural gathering places. Every lock had a grocery store, a blacksmith shop, and most importantly, a tavern. Life at the locks was a constant bustle of activity. While the boat was being raised or lowered, the captain might jump off to buy fresh supplies or exchange news with other captains. The lock tender was the king of this small domain, responsible for operating the heavy wooden gates and ensuring that the water levels remained stable. It was a position of great responsibility and often great frustration. Arguments frequently broke out over whose turn it was to enter the lock, and lock fights were a common occurrence. These were brutal, bare-knuckled brawls between the crews of rival boats, often settled right on the towpath while the mules looked on with bored indifference. The winner of the fight got to go through the lock first, a prize that was worth the bruised ribs and blackened eyes in the competitive world of the canal. The cargo being moved was also changing. In the early days, it was mostly raw materials, timber, grain, and potash. But as the Industrial Revolution began to take hold in the East, the canal started carrying manufactured goods to the growing cities of the West. Steam engines, factory machinery, fine furniture from New York City, and even grand pianos were carefully loaded into the hulks of the canal boats. In return, the West sent back not just wheat, but also wool, whiskey, and the massive amounts of coal needed to fuel the factories of New England. The canal was the circulatory system of the American economy, pumping the lifeblood of trade through the heart of the country. Even the ice industry became a significant player. In the winter, ice harvested from the clean lakes of the north was stored in massive sawdust-insulated ice houses along the canal. When the water thawed in the spring, this ice was shipped south to New York City, allowing the wealthy to enjoy chilled drinks and fresh meat even in the sweltering heat of August. This era also saw the rise of the line boats and the packet boats. Line boats were the workhorses, carrying both freight and passengers who couldn't afford the higher fares of the packets. They were slower and more crowded, often smelling of the various goods stored in the hold. Packet boats, on the other hand, were the express vessels of the canal. They were sleek, painted in bright colors, and pulled by teams of 3 or 4 fast horses that were changed every 10 miles at relay stations. These boats had right-of-way over all other traffic. When a packet boat's horn sounded, a long, mournful note that echoed through the woods, Every other boat, no matter how large, had to slacken its tow line and pull to the side to let the packet pass. For a few extra dollars, a passenger on a packet boat could travel in relative luxury, enjoying prepared meals, a small library of books, and the company of other middle-class travelers, all while gliding silently through the landscape at the breakneck speed of 5 miles per hour. However, a new shadow was beginning to fall across the towpath: the railroad. In the 1830s and 40s, the first steam locomotives began to appear in New York. At first, they were seen as a joke: loud, dirty, dangerous machines that frequently broke down or set fire to nearby haystacks with their sparks. The canal interests, powerful and wealthy, lobbied the state government to pass laws protecting the canal. For years, railroads in New York were legally forbidden from carrying freight, or were required to pay the state a toll equivalent to what the canal would have earned for the same trip. But the march of technology was relentless. The railroad didn't freeze in the winter. It could climb hills that no canal could ever navigate, and it was significantly faster. The canal versus rail rivalry became one of the great economic battles of the 19th century. Yet for a long time the canal held its own. For heavy, bulky goods like stone, coal, and timber, the slow and steady canal boat was still far more economical than the early, fragile trains. The two systems existed in an uneasy tension, a transition period between the age of wood and water and the age of iron and steam. As the 1850s approached, the canal's role in the looming national crisis of the Civil War began to take shape. The Erie Canal had effectively tied the interests of the Great Lakes states, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan, to the Northeast and New York City. This economic bond was crucial. When the war eventually broke out, the Northwest remained loyal to the Union in large part because its economic survival was tied to the northern trade routes established by the canal. The canal allowed the Union to move vast quantities of food and supplies to the front lines, and it kept the northern economy humming even as the southern ports were blockaded. The big ditch that had been built for trade turned out to be one of the most important strategic assets the Union possessed, a silent, liquid ribbon of logistics that helped hold the country together when it was tearing itself apart at the seams.
Following the tumultuous years of the Civil War, the Erie Canal entered what many historians consider its golden age, a period of peak activity that lasted from the late 1860s through the early 1880s. While the railroads were indeed stretching their iron fingers across the continent, the canal remained the undisputed heavy lifter of the American economy. In the year 1862 alone, the canal moved over 5 million tons of freight, a staggering volume that required nearly 6,000 boats to be in constant motion. To look down upon the canal from a bridge in Syracuse or Utica during this era was to see a continuous, undulating serpent of timber hulls and colorful laundry flapping in the breeze. The water was almost hidden beneath the sheer density of the traffic. This was the era of the Great Enlargement finally bearing its full fruit. The canal was now a wide, deep highway of commerce, and the boats had evolved to match its scale. The design of the canal boats themselves became a highly specialized craft. Two primary types dominated the waters, the Laker and the Bullhead. The Lakers were massive, bluff-bowed vessels, often over 90 feet long, designed with a flat bottom to maximize cargo space in the shallow canal, but built sturdy enough to be towed across the choppy, unpredictable waters of Lake Erie or down the wide Hudson River. The Bullheads were slightly different, featuring a rounded cabin that extended all the way to the bow, giving them a distinct snub-nosed appearance. They were built mostly of white oak, fastened with heavy iron spikes, and sealed with oakum and pitch. The scent of a new canal boat was a heady mix of fresh-cut timber and boiling tar, a smell that lingered in the air of the boatyards in towns like Tonawanda and West Troy. Inside, the holds were cavernous, capable of swallowing thousands of bushels of grain or hundreds of barrels of salt. Life for the families on these boats during the 1870s became even more ritualized. As the sun began to set over the Mohawk Valley, casting long golden shadows across the towpath, the nighthawks would take over. These were the crew members or older children who handled the night shift. While the rest of the family slept in the tiny mahogany-trimmed cabins, the nighthawk would stand at the long wooden tiller, guided only by the dim glow of a kerosene lantern mounted on the bow. The silence of the night was broken only by the rhythmic clop-clop of the mules and the occasional haunting call of a distant owl. Navigating at night required an intimate knowledge of the water. A helmsman had to sense the pull of the current near a waist weir or the slight change in the boat's vibration that signaled the water was getting shallow. They steered by the silhouettes of the trees against the starry sky and the silver reflection of the moon on the water surface, a slow-motion journey through a landscape that felt entirely removed from the frantic pace of the rising industrial cities. The 1870s also marked a period of intense experimentation with steam power. For decades, the mule had reigned supreme because steam engines were too heavy, too expensive, and their churning paddles or propellers created a wash that tore apart the earthen banks of the canal. However, the state of New York, desperate to keep the canal competitive against the faster railroads, offered a prize of $100,000 in 1871 for the invention of a steam-powered vessel that could navigate the canal efficiently without damaging the banks. This led to a flurry of innovation. Dozens of strange-looking craft appeared, featuring hidden propellers, recessed wheels, and even caterpillar tracks that tried to grip the canal bottom. Most failed spectacularly, but a few, like the William Newman, proved that steam could work if handled carefully. Slowly, the puffing of steam engines and the dark plumes of coal smoke began to mingle with the ancient smell of mule manure and swamp water. Yet, the transition was slow. The mule was a reliable, low-maintenance technology that didn't require a licensed engineer or a ton of expensive coal to keep moving. One of the most significant shifts in the canal's history occurred in 1882, when the people of New York voted to abolish all tolls on the Erie Canal. For over 60 years, the canal had been a massive revenue generator for the state, paying for its own construction and many other public works. But by making the canal free to use, the state turned it into a true public highway, much like the interstate system of today. This was a strategic move to lower the cost of living for everyone. If the canal was free, the price of bread in New York City stayed low because the wheat from the Midwest could travel for almost nothing. This policy gave the canal a second wind, allowing it to remain a viable competitor to the railroads for several more decades. It turned the waterway into a symbol of the common good, a shared resource that belonged to every citizen, from the wealthiest merchant on Wall Street to the humblest farmer in the Genesee Valley. As the 19th century drew to a close, the environment around the canal had been permanently altered. The liquid highway had acted as a biological corridor, inadvertently transporting species across the Appalachian Barrier. Fish, plants, and even insects that had once been confined to the Great Lakes Basin found their way into the Hudson River watershed, and vice versa. The canal was no longer just a human construction, it was a functioning ecosystem. The constant dredging required to keep the channel open created massive mounds of spoil along the banks, which became home to unique communities of wildflowers and shrubs. The water itself, though often murky with the silt of 1,000 miles of travel, was a source of life for the countless farms that lined its route. Farmers would pump canal water to irrigate their crops during dry summers, and their livestock would gather at the watering places along the towpath to drink. The canal had become so integrated into the fabric of the New York landscape that it was hard to imagine the state without it. It was the thread that wove together the forests of the West, the factories of the center, and the great harbor of the East into a single prosperous tapestry.
As the 19th century began to fade into the 20th, the Erie Canal faced its most daunting challenge yet, the obsolescence of its own design. The world was moving faster, the machines were getting bigger, and the great enlargement that had seemed so permanent in the 1860s was now straining under the weight of a new industrial era. The railroads had become an iron web across the state, moving freight with a speed the slow-moving canal boats could never match. Many believed the era of the canal was over, that the big ditch would eventually be filled in and forgotten, a relic of a primitive age. But the leaders of New York were not ready to abandon the waterway that had built their empire. In 1903, the citizens of the state made a monumental decision, voting to authorize a massive $101 million bond, an astronomical sum at the time, to transform the canal once again. This would not be a mere widening. It was the birth of the New York State Barge Canal, a project so vast it would essentially re-engineer the geography of the entire state. The Barge Canal project was a radical departure from the original concept of a hand-dug trench. Instead of building a separate channel alongside the rivers, the engineers decided to canalize the rivers themselves. They took the Mohawk River, the Seneca River, and the Oneida River and tamed them with a series of massive concrete dams and locks. This meant the old towpaths, where generations of mules and hoggies had walked, were slowly reclaimed by the forest or submerged under rising waters. The era of animal power was officially drawing to a close. To replace the mules, a new generation of vessels appeared, the motorized barge and the powerful steel tugboat. These boats didn't need a path on the bank. They carried their own engines, their rhythmic, low-frequency thrumming replacing the quiet clop-clop of hooves. This change altered the very atmosphere of the canal. The silence of the 1800s was replaced by the steady industrial heartbeat of internal combustion, a sound that resonated through the valleys and echoed off the stone cliffs of the Mohawk. The engineering of the Barge Canal was a marvel of the early 20th century, utilizing the newfound power of electricity and reinforced concrete. The locks were no longer made of hand-cut limestone blocks. They were monolithic structures of gray concrete, some as deep as 40 feet, operated not by manual labor, but by the flick of a switch. One of the most incredible sights of this new system was the Waterford Flight, a series of 5 massive locks that lifted boats 169 feet in less than 2 miles. It remains one of the steepest climbs in the world for a navigational waterway. Watching a massive steel barge laden with thousands of tons of oil or grain enter one of these concrete canyons was a lesson in the scale of human ambition. As the gates closed with a heavy metallic thud, the water would boil and churn with incredible force, lifting the vessel with a silent, relentless power that felt almost geological. The landscape of the canal corridor shifted during this transition. Because the new route often followed the natural riverbeds, the canal felt less like a man-made ditch and more like a series of wide, tranquil lakes. The vistas opened up, offering travelers views of the rolling hills and dense forests that had previously been hidden behind high earthen banks. In the towns, the old canal that ran through the center of the business districts was often filled in or converted into roads. Syracuse's Erie Boulevard and Rochester's Broad Street are built directly on top of the original waterway. But the spirit of the canal remained. The new canal, slightly to the north or south, continued to feed the industries that lined its banks. Great concrete silos and sprawling brick factories rose up at the water's edge, their loading docks designed specifically to interface with the massive barges that now plied the route. The people who worked the barge canal were a different breed from the old-time canalers. The family-run boat was becoming rarer, replaced by professional crews employed by large shipping corporations. These men were sailors of the inland seas, experts in navigating the currents of the rivers and the tight squeezes of the concrete locks. The tugboat captain became the new hero of the waterway, a master of physics who could maneuver a 300-foot barge through a narrow bridge opening with only inches to spare. Life on the tug was a world of diesel fumes, grease-stained brass, and the constant vibrating energy of the engine room. At night, the tugs used powerful electric searchlights to cut through the darkness, their beams sweeping across the water and the trees like the eyes of a giant, searching for the next buoy or the looming silhouette of a lock entrance. Despite the shift to industrialization, there was still a profound sense of peace to be found on the water. Even with a diesel engine, a boat on the canal moves at a dignified pace. The journey from Buffalo to Albany still took several days, a slow-motion transit through the heart of New York. The canal remained a world apart from the frantic pace of the highways and railroads. On a quiet evening in the 1920s, as the mist began to rise from the Mohawk River, one could still feel the weight of history in the air. The water was still the same water that DeWitt Clinton had envisioned, a liquid link between the mountains and the sea. The barge canal ensured that even in the age of the automobile, the ancient logic of the water route remained relevant, providing a low-cost, high-capacity artery for the raw materials that continued to build the American century. It was a bridge between the pioneering past and the technological future, a testament to the idea that some paths, once forged, are meant to be traveled forever.
The 1930s and 1940s brought a different kind of importance to the New York State Barge Canal, one that solidified its status as a vital national security asset. During the Great Depression, while the rest of the country's economy seemed to grind to a painful halt, the canal remained a steady, pulsing artery of activity. It was during these lean years that the cargo began to shift from the traditional agricultural products of the 19th century toward the industrial fuels of the 20th. Petroleum became the king of the canal. Long, low-slung tankers, their decks barely inches above the waterline, moved millions of gallons of heating oil, gasoline, and kerosene from the refineries of New Jersey, up the Hudson and through the canal to the growing cities of the Great Lakes. To watch these tankers navigate the locks was to witness a delicate dance of weight and water. Because they were so heavy and carried such volatile cargo, they moved with an almost ceremonial slowness, their powerful diesel engines emitting a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate through the very bedrock of the canal towns. When the United States entered World War II, the canal's strategic value reached its zenith. With German U-boats prowling the Atlantic coast and attacking merchant ships, the inland protected waters of the canal became a safer alternative for moving critical war supplies. The canal was no longer just a commercial route, it was a lifeline. It carried scrap metal for the steel mills, chemicals for munitions, and even small naval vessels built in the Great Lakes shipyards that needed to reach the Atlantic. The work on the canal became a 24-hour-a-day operation. The locks were perpetually lit by high-intensity floodlights, casting long, dramatic shadows against the concrete walls as the tugs and barges shuffled through the darkness. The men who worked the canal during this time felt the weight of the war effort in every ton of cargo they moved. The monotonous, steady pace of the canal provided a sense of order and purpose in a world that had otherwise descended into chaos. It was a silent, liquid conveyor belt
that helped fuel the arsenal of democracy. The life of a tugboat crew in the mid-1940s was defined by a specific kind of industrial rhythm. The tugs, often powered by massive Fairbanks Morse or Enterprise diesel engines, were self-contained worlds of steel and grease. The engine room was the heart of the vessel, a place of intense heat and the rhythmic, percussive chug-chug-chug of the cylinders. A good engineer could diagnose a mechanical issue simply by feeling the vibration of the deck plates under his boots. The smell of the tug was a permanent fixture, a mixture of diesel fuel, hot oil, and the strong black coffee that was always brewing in the galley. These crews worked in shifts, 6 hours on and 6 hours off, a cycle that made time feel fluid and indistinct. Day merged into night as they bypassed town after town, seeing the world through the rectangular frame of the pilot house windows. They watched the seasons change in the Mohawk Valley, the brilliant greens of spring giving way to the heavy, humid heat of summer, followed by the fiery reds of the autumn maples and the stark, gray silence of the approaching winter. One of the most impressive feats of the mid-century canal was the management of the pool levels. Because the barge canal utilized the natural river systems, the engineers had to master the art of controlling the flow of the entire Mohawk and Seneca watersheds. They used a series of movable dams, massive steel structures that looked like bridge trusses with heavy shutters that could be raised or lowered into the water. In times of heavy rain, the dams were raised to prevent flooding. During dry spells, they were lowered to trap enough water to keep the canal navigable. This constant manipulation of the environment created a strange hybrid landscape, part wild river, part precision-engineered machine. The water was never truly still. It was always being pushed, pulled, and directed by the invisible hands of the New York State Department of Public Works. However, as the 1950s dawned, a new and formidable competitor appeared on the horizon, one that would eventually signal the end of the canal's era as a major commercial powerhouse, the St. Lawrence Seaway. This massive international project, completed in 1959, allowed deep-draft ocean-going ships to bypass New York entirely, sailing directly from the Atlantic into the Great Lakes via the St. Lawrence River. Suddenly, the Erie Canal, even in its enlarged barge canal form, was too small and too slow for the giant freighters of the modern age. At the same time, the Eisenhower administration began the construction of the interstate highway system. The New York State Thoroughway, which often ran parallel to the canal, allowed semi-trucks to move freight across the state in hours rather than days. The slow, rhythmic pace of the water, which had once been the canal's greatest strength, now became its greatest liability in an increasingly impatient world. The decline was gradual but undeniable. One by one, the large shipping companies began to retire their canal fleets. The massive concrete grain elevators in Buffalo, once the busiest in the world, began to stand empty, their shadows stretching over the quiet waters of the harbor. The canal towns, which had built their identity around the flow of the big ditch, began to look inward, away from the water. The bustling grocery stores and blacksmith shops at the locks were replaced by quiet parks or abandoned buildings. Yet even as the commercial traffic thinned, the canal did not disappear. It began a slow, graceful transition into a different kind of life. The water was still there, the locks still functioned, and the history was etched into every stone and concrete wall. The canal was no longer a highway of necessity, but it was becoming something else, a monument to a time when Americans first learned how to conquer the geography of their own continent with nothing but ambition and a very long ditch.
By the 1960s and 1970s, the Erie Canal had entered a period of quiet reflection, a long afternoon in its storied life. The frantic industrial energy that had characterized the 19th and early 20th centuries had largely dissipated, leaving behind a waterway that felt like a beautiful, half-forgotten secret winding through the heart of New York. While a few commercial barges still made their way from Albany to Buffalo, carrying loads of jet fuel for airports or oversized industrial equipment that couldn't fit on trucks, the primary users of the canal were changing. This was the era of the pleasure craft. Families from across the Northeast began to discover that the canal was not just a shipping lane, but a unique, slow-moving park. They came in mahogany Chris Crafts and the new lightweight fiberglass cruisers, seeking a vacation that moved at the speed of a walking pace. This shift toward recreation required a change in the way the canal was managed. The lock tenders, who had once been the gatekeepers of a global trade route, now became something akin to park rangers. They were the ones who greeted the weekend sailors, helping them tie up their lines and offering advice on the best places to find a slice of pie or a cold soda in the next town. The atmosphere at the locks became more relaxed, less about the lock fights of the past and more about the shared community of the water. For the lock tenders, many of whom came from families that had worked the canal for generations, this was a time of preservation. They kept the massive steel gates painted, the concrete walls clean, and the lawn-like embankments meticulously mowed. The canal was no longer just a machine, it was becoming a garden. One of the most remarkable things about this era was the recovery of the canal's environment. For over a century, the industrial towns along the route had used the canal and the adjacent rivers as a convenient disposal system for factory waste and sewage. But with the passage of the Clean Water Act and the decline of heavy industry, the water began to clear. Fish populations that had struggled for decades, bass, northern pike, and even the occasional walleye, began to thrive in the slow-moving currents of the canalized rivers. The liquid highway was becoming a living ecosystem once again. Bird life returned in abundance. Blue herons would stand motionless along the banks, watching the pleasure boats glide by, and ospreys began to build their massive nests atop the abandoned telegraph poles that still lined the old towpaths. For the traveler, the journey through the canal became a lesson in the resilience of nature. The 1970s also saw a rising interest in the Old Erie, the original abandoned sections of the canal that had been left behind when the barge canal was built in 1918. In towns like Jordan, Camillus, and Shokari, the remnants of the old stone locks and aqueducts sat like ancient ruins in the middle of forests or farmers' fields. A grassroots movement of history enthusiasts and local residents began to realize that these ruins were the birthright of the state. They started clearing away the brush, stabilizing the crumbling masonry, and creating canal parks. These were quiet places where one could walk along the original towpath, tracing the footsteps of the 19th century hoggies. You could stand in the middle of a dry stone lock and look up at the walls, imagining the wood-hulled boats that had once rested there, the smell of the mules, and the sound of the captain's horn. These parks preserved the human scale of the original project, a reminder of what could be achieved with nothing but shovels, wheelbarrows, and a single vision. The physical experience of the canal in the autumn was particularly enchanting during these years. As the maples and oaks turned into a riot of gold and crimson, the water acted as a mirror, doubling the intensity of the colors. A boat traveling through the Mohawk Valley in October felt as though it were moving through a painted landscape. The air would be crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the nearby farmhouses and the earthy aroma of fallen leaves. Because the canal follows the lowest point in the landscape, it acts as a natural collector of the morning mist. A boater waking up at a lockside tie-up would often find their vessel enveloped in a soft, white world, the silence so profound that the drip of dew from the canopy was the only sound. As the sun rose, the mist would slowly burn off, revealing the silhouettes of the concrete bridges and the distant rolling hills of the Adirondacks to the north and the Catskills to the south. Yet even in this era of recreation and beauty, the canal remained a formidable engineering challenge. The infrastructure was aging, and the harsh New York winters took a toll on the concrete and steel. Maintaining the pool levels remained a high-stakes game of water management.
Every spring, the engineers had to carefully balance the runoff from the melting snow in the mountains to prevent the canal from overwhelming the towns. The movable dams on the Mohawk were still raised and lowered with a rhythmic regularity, a mechanical ballet that had been performed for over 50 years. The men of the New York State Canal Corporation, the successors to the old Department of Public Works, were the quiet stewards of this system. They were the ones who dove into the freezing water to clear debris from the intake valves or worked through the night to repair a hydraulic leak in a lock gate. They knew every leak, every crack, and every quirk of the 363-mile system. Their dedication ensured that the Big Ditch remained not just a memory, but a functioning reality for a new generation of Americans.
As the calendar turned into the 1980s and 1990s, the Erie Canal underwent its most significant administrative shift since its inception. In a move that signaled the final transition from a transportation utility to a historical and recreational treasure, the management of the canal was transferred from the New York State Department of Transportation to the New York State Thruway Authority in 1992. This was not merely a change in paperwork, it represented a fundamental change in philosophy. The canal was no longer being managed as a competitor to the railroads or highways, but as a sister to them, a linear park that complemented the fast-paced world of the thruway with its own deliberate, rhythmic slowdown. This era saw the birth of the Canal Recreation Way Plan, a massive statewide effort to transform the 524-mile system, including the lateral branches to the Finger Lakes and Lake Champlain, into a world-class destination for boaters, hikers, and history enthusiasts. The most visible manifestation of this new era was the development of the Erie Canalway Trail. For over a century, the towpath had been a rugged, muddy track meant for the hooves of weary mules and the calloused feet of young hoggies. Now it was being reimagined as a continuous multi-use path stretching from Buffalo to Albany. Stone dust and asphalt replaced the mud and manure. Cyclists, joggers, and cross-country skiers began to populate the corridor where teamsters once cursed the rain. To travel the trail today is to participate in a form of horizontal archaeology. In some sections, the trail sits high on the embankments of the barge canal, offering sweeping views of the canalized Mohawk River. In others, it dives into the woods to follow the Old Erie or the enlarged Erie, passing through the literal skeletons of the 19th century. You might find yourself cycling through the archway of an abandoned stone aqueduct, the hand-carved limestone blocks still fitting together with a precision that defies the passage of 2 centuries. The silence of these wooded sections is profound, broken only by the crunch of gravel under tires and the occasional splash of a painted turtle sliding off a log into the emerald water. For the modern traveler on the water, the experience of locking through remains the quintessential canal ritual. While the technology has been updated, hydraulic rams now move the heavy gates and electric motors turn the valves, the physics of the process are unchanged from the days of DeWitt Clinton. As a boat enters the lock chamber, the world suddenly shrinks to the size of a concrete canyon. The massive steel gates close behind you with a muffled underwater thud, sealing you into a private room of water and stone. The lock tender, often watching from a small booth filled with monitors and levers, opens the sluice gates at the bottom of the chamber. There is no pump involved. Gravity does all the work. You can hear the water beginning to roar behind the walls, a deep, resonant sound like a distant waterfall. The boat begins to rise or fall, and you find yourself staring at the wet, moss-covered walls, watching the high water mark descend past your eyes. It is a slow, vertical journey, a reminder that the canal is a series of giant liquid steps carved into the face of the continent. The towns along the canal, once the grittiest industrial hubs of the North, began to reinvent themselves as canal harbors. Places like Fairport, Pittsford, and Brockport, villages that had once smelled of coal dust and rotting grain, transformed their waterfronts into vibrant community centers. The old brick warehouses were gutted and reborn as lofts, microbreweries, and bookstores. The canal front became the most desirable real estate in town. Residents and tourists alike would gather on the banks to watch the parade of vessels, the sleek motor yachts from Florida heading north for the summer, the colorful hire boats that allowed families to play captain for a week, and the occasional remaining commercial barge, a ghost of the canal's industrial past. The seasonal rhythm of the canal became the heartbeat of these communities. The first boat of the spring was a cause for celebration, a sign that winter's grip had finally broken, while the closing of the locks in November brought a quiet, reflective stillness to the waterfronts. During this period, the canal also gained international recognition for its historical significance. In 2000, the United States Congress designated the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor, officially recognizing the waterway as one of the most important landscapes in the American story. This designation helped secure funding for preservation and education, ensuring that the stories of the Irish laborers, the visionary engineers, and the generations of canalers would not be lost to time.
Museums like the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse, housed in the only remaining waylock building in the world, became repositories of this heritage. Visitors could stand in the very spot where canal boats were once weighed to determine their tolls, looking at the massive scales that could measure hundreds of tons with the delicacy of a jeweler's balance. The artifacts preserved here, the long wooden tillers, the brass lanterns, the mule harnesses, act as physical anchors to a vanished world. Environmental stewardship also became a hallmark of the late 20th century canal. The waterway had become an accidental sanctuary for wildlife. Because the canal corridor provides a continuous strip of water and green space across the state, it serves as a vital migration route. In the quiet waterways created by the dams, massive beds of water lilies provide cover for largemouth bass and northern pike. Great blue herons are the unofficial mascots of the modern canal, often seen standing as statues on the lock walls, their sharp eyes scanning the water for a meal. Beavers, once nearly trapped to extinction for their fur, have returned in force, their stick-and mud lodges visible in the more remote sections of the Mohawk and Seneca rivers. For the person drifting silently in a kayak or a canal boat, the experience is one of deep immersion in a landscape that has managed to find a balance between human engineering and natural wildness. The canal is no longer a wound in the earth, it is a scar that has healed into a beautiful, functional part of the New York geography. As the sun sets on a summer evening in the 1880s, the 1920s, or the 1922s, the atmosphere of the canal remains remarkably consistent. The air grows cool near the water, carrying the scent of damp earth and river plants. The lights of the villages begin to twinkle on the surface, shimmering in the wake of a passing boat. There is a sense of permanence here, a feeling that this liquid highway will always be part of the land. It is a place where time moves differently, not in seconds and minutes, but in the steady 4-mile-per-hour pace of a mule or the 20-minute cycle of a lock. It is a monument to the audacity of the human spirit, a 363-mile-long testament to the idea that if you want to change the world, sometimes you just have to start digging.
In the opening decade of the 21st century, the Erie Canal found itself navigating the digital age, a time when physical infrastructure often seemed secondary to the invisible networks of the Internet. Yet, remarkably, the canal's relevance did not fade. Instead, it evolved into a vital case study in sustainable tourism and historic preservation. The year 2017 marked the bicentennial of the first turning of the Earth in Rome, New York. This anniversary sparked a statewide reflection on the canal's legacy, leading to a renewed commitment to its future. The Reimagine the Canals initiative was launched, a bold project aimed at finding new ways to use the infrastructure for the next 100 years. This included everything from ice fishing tourism in the winter to using the canal's massive water-moving capabilities to help local farmers mitigate the effects of climate change. The canal was proving, once again, that it was a flexible tool, capable of serving whatever needs the people of New York required. The modern engineering of the canal, while hidden behind concrete and steel, is a fascinating blend of old-world mechanics and new-world technology. If you visit a lock today, you might see a lock tender operating the system via a touchscreen interface, but the massive valves they are controlling are still governed by the same principles of fluid dynamics that Nathan Roberts puzzled over in the 1820s. The underwater life of the canal is constantly monitored by sonar and sensors. Maintenance crews now use underwater drones to inspect the integrity of the lock sills and the massive miter gates that must hold back millions of pounds of water pressure. These gates, though now made of reinforced steel instead of the white oak of the 19th century, still meet at a precise angle to create a watertight seal, the same V shape that has been used since the time of Leonardo da Vinci. One of the most poignant aspects of the contemporary canal is the winter drawdown. Every November, the water level is lowered in certain sections to prevent ice damage to the walls and to allow for heavy maintenance. When the water recedes, the canal reveals its secrets. Mud-covered relics of the past, old anchors, lost tools, and the occasional bicycle emerge from the silt. Engineers use this time to walk the floor of the canal, inspecting the masonry and the puddling clay that has kept the ditch watertight for generations. Standing on the bottom of the canal in the middle of January, with the high walls of a lock looming above you, provides a perspective on the sheer scale of the excavation that is impossible to grasp when the water is high. It is a moment of raw skeletal history, where the hand-carved stone meets the modern concrete in a cold, quiet embrace. The canal has also become a sanctuary for a unique kind of nomadic community, the Great Loopers. These are long-distance cruisers who navigate a 6,000-mile continuous water route that circumnavigates the eastern United States. For these travelers, the Erie Canal is a highlight of their one-year journey. They enter from the Great Lakes or the Hudson River, their boats decked out with solar panels and satellite dishes, yet they find themselves humbled by the slow pace of the locks. They swap stories at the town docks in Medina or Whitehall, sharing tips on where to find the best local blueberries or which lock tender tells the best jokes. This modern-day fleet brings a global perspective to the small canal towns of upstate New York, connecting the local history of upstate New York to the wider maritime world of the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. As we look toward the future, the Erie Canal stands as a reminder that the great projects of the past are never truly finished. They are living things that require constant care, imagination, and respect. The canal survived the rise of the railroad, the birth of the automobile, and the era of the jet engine. It survived because it offers something that speed can never provide, a connection to the physical earth, and a reminder of the human scale of progress. Whether it is a kayaker paddling through the morning mist, a cyclist traversing the towpath trail, or a tugboat pushing a heavy load of stone, everyone who touches the canal becomes part of its long, flowing narrative. It is a story written in water, a 363-mile-long testament to the idea that greatness is built one shovelful, one lock, and 1 mile at a time. While the grand narrative of the Erie Canal is often told through its economic triumphs and engineering marvels, there is a darker, more somber history that flows beneath its surface. To truly understand the Big Ditch, one must acknowledge the human cost of its creation and the quiet tragedies that occurred along its banks. The 1820s and 30s were not just years of progress, they were years of immense suffering for the thousands of nameless laborers who disappeared into the muck of the Montezuma swamp. It is estimated that for every mile of the original canal, several men lost their lives to disease, accidents, or the sheer exhaustion of the work. In the height of summer, the stagnant waters of the unfinished ditch became a breeding ground for the shakes, a local name for the malaria and cholera that swept through the labor camps. Because many of the workers were Irish immigrants with no family in the country, they were often buried in unmarked graves right in the embankment of the canal they were digging. Today, as you walk the towpath, you are quite literally walking over the final resting places of the men who built the path beneath your feet. The psychological toll on these men was equally heavy. Living in primitive shanties, far from their homes, and facing the constant threat of injury from falling rock or premature black powder blasts, many turned to the only solace available, canal whiskey. This was a crude, potent spirit, often distributed by the contractors themselves as part of the daily wage. It served a dual purpose. It dulled the physical pain of the labor and kept the men tethered to the job site. The nights in the labor camps were often rowdy and violent, filled with the songs of the old country and the brawls of the new. This culture of hard drinking and hard living gave the canal a reputation for lawlessness that lasted for decades. In the eyes of the polite society in New York City, the canal corridor was a wild, untamed frontier, a place where the rules of civilization were as fluid as the water in the ditch. As the canal matured, it also became a place of mysterious disappearances and folklore. Every canal town had its share of ghost stories, tales of phantom mule teams seen on the towpath during a full moon, or the lady in white who was said to haunt the aqueduct at Rochester, searching for a child lost to the currents. These stories weren't just superstitions, they reflected the very real dangers of life on the water. The canal was a magnet for those seeking to disappear. A man could board a boat in Albany, change his name, and be 1,000 miles in the wilderness of the Ohio Territory before anyone knew he was gone. The dark, opaque water of the canal held its secrets well. Over the years, countless items and occasionally people fell into the water and were never recovered until the winter drawdowns, if at all. The canal was a place of transitions where people were always moving and nothing was ever quite permanent. The relationship between the canal and the indigenous people of New York, particularly the Haudenosaunee-Iroquois Confederacy, is another complex layer of this history. The canal was cut directly through the ancestral lands of the Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations. While the state negotiated treaties for the land, the pressure of the canal fever led to the rapid displacement of these communities. The very prosperity that the canal brought to the white settlers was often mirrored by the loss of land and traditional ways of life for the original inhabitants. The salt springs of Syracuse, which became a cornerstone of the canal's economy, had been sacred sites for the Onondaga for centuries. As the industrial machinery of the salt works took over, the indigenous connection to the land was physically and legally severed. To understand the Erie Canal is to recognize it as a tool of empire, one that built a state while simultaneously rewriting the map of an ancient civilization. Even the animals that powered the canal lived lives of silent, grueling labor. A canal mule was a prized possession, often more worth to a captain than a hired hand, yet their lives were short and difficult. They worked in 6-hour shifts, pulling weights that were technically impossible for a single animal, made possible only by the lack of friction in the water. They suffered from collar sores, lameness from the rocky towpath, and the constant bite of the canal flies that swarmed in the humidity. A good hoggy cared for his mules, knowing that his own survival depended on theirs, but the pressure to make time and deliver cargo often led to the animals being pushed beyond their limits. When a mule finally collapsed on the path, it was often unhitched and left behind, replaced by a fresh animal from a relay station, a literal cog in the machine of progress. This mixture of tragedy and triumph is what gives the Erie Canal its unique character. It wasn't built by a government with infinite resources and modern machinery. It was built by a young, struggling nation that was making it up as it went along. Every stone in every lock was set by a man who was probably tired, hungry, and far from home. Every mile of water represents a victory over the mud, the mountains, and the skeptics. When you look at the canal today, you aren't just looking at a waterway. You are looking at a monument to human persistence, with all its flaws, its darkness, and its incredible, world-changing ambition. The water is quiet now, But if you listen closely to the lap of the waves against the stone, you can almost hear the echoes of the thousands of voices that once filled this valley, the shouts of the teamsters, the songs of the Irish, and the splash of the oars that started it all. As the 19th century matured, the Erie Canal became more than just a path for wheat and coal. It became a floating stage for the strange and the spectacular. One of the most enchanting chapters in the canal's history is the era of the showboats and the floating circuses. In an age before cinema or radio, the arrival of a canal boat was the primary source of entertainment for the isolated farming villages of upstate New York. Imagine the excitement of a young child in a quiet hamlet like Spencerport or Gasport, hearing the distant brassy blare of a calliope echoing off the water. Around the bend would come a boat unlike any other, painted in garish reds and golds, adorned with fluttering banners, and carrying a cargo of wonder. These floating circuses were logistical marvels. Because a canal boat offered a stable, wide platform, entire troops of acrobats, clowns, and even small menageries of exotic animals could be transported from town to town with ease. There are historical accounts of elephants being led onto specially reinforced canal boats, their massive weight causing the timber hulls to groan as they were towed slowly through the Mohawk Valley. For the people on the banks, seeing an African elephant or a Bengal tiger gliding past a cornfield was a sight so surreal it bordered on the miraculous. The circus would tie up at the town dock, and for a few pennies, the locals could enter a world of magic that felt completely disconnected from the daily grind of the harvest. Parallel to the circuses were the floating palaces, theatrical boats that brought Shakespeare, melodrama, and minstrel shows to the frontier. These boats were essentially floating theaters with stages, velvet curtains, and seating for hundreds of people. The acoustics of the canal were surprisingly helpful. The high earthen banks often acted as a natural amphitheater, carrying the voices of the actors across the water to the crowds gathered on the towpath. These shows provided a cultural bridge, bringing the sophisticated arts of New York City and London to the rugged interior of the continent. However, life for the performers was not always glamorous. They lived in cramped quarters, shared the water with mule teams, and often had to deal with canal pirates, groups of rowdy men who would try to board the boats or steal the box office receipts under the cover of night. Beyond the glitz of the showboats, the canal was also home to a less visible but equally fascinating industry, the floating groceries and canal peddlers. Because the canal was a closed system, entrepreneurs realized they could bring the store to the customer. Boats were outfitted as mobile general stores, stocked with everything from fine silk and Belgian lace to hardware, spices, and medicine. A farm wife living miles from the nearest town could simply walk down to her dock when she saw the peddler's flag and trade her eggs or butter for a new set of needles or a bottle of liniment from man or beast. These peddlers were the lifeblood of the rural economy, acting as traveling news carriers and gossip mongers, stitching the disparate canal communities together into a single social fabric. The maintenance of the canal also saw its own set of technological wonders, specifically in the form of the steam dredges. As the canal aged, it constantly fought a battle against silt. Gravity and rain conspired to wash the surrounding hillsides into the ditch, threatening to make the water too shallow for the heavy barges. The solution was the dredge, a massive floating machine equipped with a series of iron buckets on a continuous chain or a giant clamshell scoop. Powered by a thundering steam engine, these machines were the mechanical monsters of the 19th century. They worked year-round, even in the dead of winter, their iron teeth biting into the frozen mud and dumping it into scows to be hauled away. The sound of a dredge at work, the hiss of steam, the clanking of chains, and the wet thwack of mud hitting the deck was a constant background noise for the canal towns, a reminder that the liquid highway required constant, violent effort to keep it alive. One of the more peculiar historical footnotes involves the canal mail. Before the advent of the official railway mail service, the Erie Canal was the fastest way to move letters across the state. Packet boats had specialized leather bags that would be tossed onto the docks as the boat glided past at 5 miles per hour. The post riders would be waiting on their horses to gallop the mail to the inland villages. It was a primitive but effective system of high-speed communication that preceded the telegraph. There was a sense of urgency to the canal mail. If a boat was delayed by a broken lock or a grounded mule, the economic ripples were felt as far away as the shipping houses of London. The canal was the information superhighway of 1840, a physical network that carried the thoughts, business deals, and love letters of a nation in transition. As the sun sets on this portion of our journey, we reflect on the sheer variety of life that the canal supported. It was not just a ditch for water, it was a 363-mile-long laboratory for human experience. It was a place where an elephant could meet a steam engine, where a Shakespearean actor could share a meal with a mule driver, and where the dreams of a young nation were quite literally floated into reality. The canal was a world of contrasts, the brutal labor of the diggers against the refined music of the showboats, the silence of the misty mornings against the roar of the steam dredges. Every mile of the Erie Canal contains 1,000 stories, some written in the ledger books of merchants, and some whispered in the ghosts of the old stone locks.
The nomenclature of the Erie Canal corridor is a map of a young nation's aspirations, a linguistic testament to the classical fever that gripped America in the early 19th century. As you travel from east to west, you pass through a litany of ancient names: Troy, Utica, Rome, Syracuse, Ithaca, and Palmyra. This was not an accident. The planners and settlers of New York saw themselves as the heirs to the great empires of antiquity. They weren't just digging a ditch, they were building a new Rome, a new civilization in the wilderness. Syracuse, for instance, was named after the ancient Sicilian city because of its nearby salt springs and its potential for maritime greatness. Rome, New York, was built on the site of Fort Stanwix, a strategic carrying place between the Mohawk River and Wood Creek. These names gave the muddy, rough-and-tumble canal towns a sense of historical weight, as if the very water flowing through the locks carried the dignity of 1,000 years of Western civilization. However, beneath the grand names lay a more watery reality, the lost villages of the Erie Canal. During the various enlargements of the canal, particularly the transition to the barge canal in the early 20th century, the geography of the state was permanently altered. To create the vast pool levels and reservoirs needed to feed the modern system, several small communities were intentionally flooded. In places like the Hinckley or Delta reservoirs, entire hamlets were abandoned. If the water level drops low enough during a severe drought, the remains of these ghost towns reappear like skeletal apparitions. You can see the stone foundations of houses, the outlines of old roads, and the stumps of orchards that were cut down over a century ago. These drowned villages are the silent casualties of progress, places where families once lived and worked,
now preserved in a cold, watery amber. The early 1900s also brought a brief but fascinating experiment with the electric mule. As the internal combustion engine was still in its infancy and the cost of maintaining live mules was rising, engineers looked to the newly harnessed power of electricity to solve the canal's propulsion problems. At several points along the canal, particularly near Schenectady, experimental tracks were laid along the towpath. These were not for trains, but for mules made of iron and copper, small electric locomotives designed to tow the canal boats. The idea was to eliminate the need for animal power and the wash created by propellers. For a few years, these silent, humming machines pulled lines of boats through the valley, their overhead wires sparking in the night. While the experiment ultimately failed due to the high cost of infrastructure, it represented a moment of incredible transition, where the ancient technology of the towpath met the cutting-edge science of the Edison era. Life on the water during this time was also being revolutionized by the first electric canal boats. These were often smaller pleasure craft or inspection vessels, but they represented a vision of a clean, quiet canal. Unlike the roaring diesel tugs that would eventually dominate, these electric boats glided with a ghostly silence. A passenger sitting on the deck could hear the ripple of the water against the hull and the wind in the willow trees along the bank, a sensory experience that mirrored the early days of the horse-drawn packets. It was a brief, elegant pause in the canal's industrial evolution, a reminder that the liquid highway could also be a place of profound tranquility. In the late 1800s, the canal also became a hub for a strange and specific type of winter industry, the ice harvest. While the canal was closed to navigation, it became a massive factory for cold. In towns like Cohoes and Green Island, thousands of men were employed to plow the frozen canal surface, cutting the ice into massive blocks using horse-drawn saws. These blocks, often 2 feet thick and clear as crystal, were stored in gargantuan ice houses insulated with tons of sawdust. This canal ice was a vital commodity for New York City, used to preserve food and cool the drinks of the wealthy in the days before mechanical refrigeration. The sight of hundreds of men and horses working on the frozen expanse of the canal under the pale winter sun was one of the great spectacles of the Victorian era, a bustling, frigid city that existed only for a few months each year. As we delve deeper into the layers of the canal's history, we encounter the stories of the canal divers. Long before modern scuba gear, these men were hired to perform underwater repairs on the locks, hills, and gates. They wore primitive hard-hat diving suits, massive copper helmets bolted to heavy canvas suits, with air supplied by a hand-cranked pump on the deck of a boat. Working in the dark, silt-laden waters of the canal, they relied entirely on touch. They would feel their way along the massive wooden timbers, identifying leaks or obstructions with their calloused hands. It was a terrifyingly claustrophobic job. A single snag on a piece of jagged timber or a failure of the air pump meant a slow death in the murky depths. These divers were the silent mechanics of the canal, ensuring that the invisible parts of the machine continued to function while the rest of the world passed by overhead, oblivious to the drama unfolding beneath the surface. The canal also acted as a biological bridge in ways that scientists are still studying today. As boats moved from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes, they carried more than just cargo. They carried hitchhikers. The alowife and the sea lamprey, species native to the ocean, found their way into the interior of the continent via the Erie Canal, permanently altering the ecology of the Great Lakes. Conversely, plants and insects from the Midwest migrated east. The canal was a 363-mile-long petri dish, a conduit for an accidental ecological exchange that has had lasting consequences for the natural history of North America. It is a reminder that when we build a path for ourselves, we also build a path for everything else, creating ripples in the environment that last far longer than the wood and stone of the locks themselves.
The culinary and social life of the Erie Canal was as distinct as its engineering. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the canal culture developed its own flavors, dishes born of necessity, portability, and the long, slow hours on the water. One of the most famous staples was what became known as Erie Canal beans. Because firewood was scarce on a boat and space for a large stove was non-existent, boat wives would start a pot of beans in a small, heavy iron kettle early in the morning. They would add salt pork from the hold, a splash of molasses, and perhaps some onions bought from a peddler at the last lock. This pot would simmer on the edge of the tiny coal stove for 10 or 12 hours, the low heat and constant motion of the boat perfectly tenderizing the beans. By the time the sun began to dip behind the Niagara escarpment, the smell of the savory, smoky stew would drift across the water, signaling to the weary mule driver on the towpath that the day's journey was nearing its end. This era also saw the rise of the boating clubs, the first true recreational use of the canal by the urban middle class. In cities like Rochester and Syracuse, young men and women formed rowing clubs, their sleek cedar-hulled shells a sharp contrast to the heavy timber barges. They would hold regattas on the long levels of the canal, the stretches between locks where the water was as still as a mirror. These events were major social occasions. The banks would be lined with spectators in their Sunday best, the women in wide-brimmed hats and the men in striped blazers, cheering as the oarsmen cut through the water. It was the first time the canal was viewed not just as a workplace, but as a site for health, competition, and leisure. The canal was beginning to soften its image, moving from a gritty industrial artery to a picturesque backdrop for the American dream. However, the late 1960s brought a poignant and historic moment, the final commercial through transit of the traditional era. As the massive St. Lawrence Seaway and the interstate highways bled the canal of its purpose, the number of working boats dwindled to a handful. The final journey of a traditional commercial fleet from the Great Lakes to the Hudson was an emotional event for the people of the valley. As the last tug, its engine puffing a defiant plume of smoke, moved through the locks, crowds gathered to say goodbye. It was as if a ghost was passing by. The old-timers, men who had spent 40 years on the water, stood on the lock walls with their hats in their hands. They knew that when that boat reached the Atlantic, a way of life that had defined New York for 150 years would officially pass into the realm of memory. The Big Ditch was no longer a highway. It was becoming a monument. Yet even in its retirement, the canal held on to its mysteries. One of the most fascinating aspects of the canal's later life is the story of the canal archaeologists. During major renovation projects in the late 20th century, when sections were drained for the first time in decades, workers found incredible treasures buried in the mud. They found intact sets of 19th century china, dropped by a clumsy galley hand over 100 years ago. They found ornate brass boat bells, hand-carved pipes, and even gold coins that had slipped through the cracks of a merchant's floorboards. Each item was a physical link to a specific moment in time, a rainy Tuesday in 1845, or a celebratory night in 1890. These artifacts, now housed in local museums, tell the story of the canal in a way that maps and statistics never can. They are the fingerprints of the thousands of people who called the water home. The technical mastery required to keep the canal alive in the 21st century is perhaps its final great wonder. To prevent the aging locks from crumbling, engineers now use carbon fiber wrapping and high-pressure concrete injection, modern technologies that are stitched into the original 19th century stonework. It is a marriage of eras. Beneath the high-tech sensors and hydraulic rams, the heart of the canal remains the same hand-hewn limestone that DeWitt Clinton's men pulled from the earth. The canal is a living organism, its survival guaranteed by a constant cycle of renewal. As we prepare to conclude this epic journey, we see the Erie Canal not as a relic of the past, but as a masterpiece of human continuity, a liquid thread that binds the ambition of the pioneers to the recreation of the modern world, flowing forever through the heart of the land.
As we reach the final stretch of this 15,000-word journey, we find the Erie Canal at a unique crossroads in the 21st century. It is no longer a machine of iron and sweat, nor is it merely a relic of a bygone age. It has become a liquid park, a 363-mile-long sanctuary of slow time in an era of light-speed digital distraction. The modern canal is a place where the rhythmic thrum of a drone overhead might coincide with the silent, ancient glide of a snapping turtle in the reeds below. It is a testament to the idea that some things are too important to be forgotten, and some paths are too meaningful to be paved over. The future of the canal is being written today through the Reimagine the Canals initiative. In a world facing climate uncertainty, the canal's sophisticated water management system is being repurposed to help local agriculture. The same locks that once moved barrels of salted pork are now being studied as tools to regulate floodwaters and protect the very towns they helped build. There is even talk of using the canal's flow to generate small-scale hydroelectric power, a return to the idea of the canal as a source of energy, though this time in the form of clean, renewable electrons, rather than the muscle of mules. For the traveler who walks the towpath tonight, the experience is hauntingly beautiful. As the sun sets, casting a violet glow over the Mohawk Valley, the canal becomes a mirror. You can see the stars reflected in the water, the same stars that guided the Irish diggers and the fugitive slaves seeking the North Star. The air carries the scent of wild phlox and damp limestone. There is a profound silence here, a silence that has been earned over 2 centuries of noise and industry. It is a place for reflection, where the ghosts of the past, the hoggies, the lock tenders, the showboat actors, feel like quiet companions in the dark. The Erie Canal taught America how to be a nation. It taught a young, scattered collection of states how to dream on a continental scale. It proved that geography was not a destiny, but a challenge to be met with ingenuity and grit. It created the wealth that built New York City, the ideas that fueled social revolutions, and the connection that held a country together during its darkest hours. As the water continues to flow from Lake Erie to the Hudson, it carries with it the story of a people who refuse to be stopped by mountains or marshes. We conclude this epic narrative with a sense of awe. From the first shovelful of dirt in Rome to the modern carbon fiber reinforcements, the canal remains a masterpiece of the human spirit. It is a story written in water, stone, and the collective memory of generations. The big ditch is finally at peace, but its heart still beats in every ripple, every lock, and every mile of the liquid highway. It is America's greatest ghost, a living legend that continues to flow, slow and steady, into the forever of history.